Hello and good afternoon from Düsseldorf in Germany. My name is Christian Moldenhauer. I'm Managing Director at Expert Powerhouse, Europe's fastest growing consulting network. At Expert Powerhouse, we support all companies with on-demand consultants and freelance talents so they can successfully complete important projects. Now, thanks for joining today. We have a very interesting topic coming up, and I'm pleased to host our 14th episode of our EPH Talk. Today, we're going to talk about strategic workforce management. And of course, it's a topic very relevant for all businesses and business leaders. As we have a couple of participants joining today, I would really like to know from where are you joining in today? There is a little comment field. So please open it and type in from where are you joining today so we get a bit of a feel who is participating. And of course, I'd like to invite you also, if you haven't done it already, following our EPH page, not to miss any updates in future sessions. Today, we're going to talk about strategic workforce management. And we have a great speaker with us, Ashish Malhotra. He has more than 35 years of experience in strategic workforce management, and he's not only implemented it at many US-based companies, but also he has advised even more companies in that field. He's a really distinguished senior advisor in that field, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ashish Malhotra to our Expert Powerhouse Talk.
Thank you, Christian, for having me on this cast, which I hope will be meaningful to our collective audiences.
Yeah, Ashish, a pleasure to have you. And maybe to give it a start also, and you've, of course, worked together with a lot of businesses, with a lot of companies. Maybe if you could give us a bit of an intro, how did you become a strategic workforce advisor and expert in the field of workforce management?
Sure thing. So very early in my career, I was a technology guy, generally finding talent pools and ecosystems for a company back then called 9X, which is now Verizon. It's a telecom firm here in the US, pretty large. And then subsequently for AIG, an insurance underwriter. It literally all began with us wanting to remediate our systems for Y2K, and we didn't have the adequate amount of resources. So we went looking for such resources globally. I subsequently joined a small Indian provider where I was the president of the Indian outfit and a CEO in the US. And there, we had a very unique proposition for the airline industry. So we helped not only many of our clients that I'd inherited by the time I joined, but through a large undertaking within the industry, we became an industry standard. So essentially helped almost all 200 IATA member airlines in the areas of revenue accounting and proration. After Kali, I joined a bank, Citibank, in 2007. And with my luck, that turned out to be the year of the financial meltdown. Everybody aspires to get to financial services. I got in at the wrong time. But there again, due to TARP being a regulatory body, wanting Citigroup and other such banks to reduce significant amount of monies from their cost structure, we again were challenged to find not only divest some of the businesses and divest some of the resources, but find alternative resourcing that was sharp, economical, at the right places, at the right time, and a lot more fungible and variable, something we'll talk about today during the speak. After that, I joined Time Warner, a media conglomerate, which is now Warner Brothers Discovery. Again, over here, the firm really didn't need to do any belt tightening, but they wanted to stay ahead of the curve in terms of talent strategies. And then lastly, I joined a company called Alex Partners, which is a turnaround specialty firm. They obviously do a lot of other consulting work, but Alex has helped me broaden and sharpen my tool set that I'd evolved through my experiences. So I think of myself as a buyer, seller, and an advisor for 5 to 7 years each. in an executive capacity. The transactions I've created or negotiated are sticky and sustainable. Some of them still in play for 10, 20 years. And so that's my background.
Thanks for sharing, and super interesting, of course. Yeah, you've seen so many perspectives, and if you bring them together, how would you define strategic workforce management, and what would you say are also the pain points typically companies face with regards to that?
So let's start with the pain points first. I think the most significant pain point is trusting that it works. It's stakeholder support. It's line of business or functional leadership support. It's acknowledging the need acknowledging the fact that we have a need and that need cannot necessarily be fulfilled in the immediate geography surrounding us for good talent and human capital. So the inertia, I think, is the largest pain point. The subject matter of implementation and execution and defining a strategy, once you cross that hurdle, is a lot more easier. But in terms of defining what workforce strategy is or global workforce strategy is, it's important to note that it's a deliberate mix of employees and non-employees, where the employees could be stateside, close to headquarters and operating offices, or the employees could be in a remote location, near shore, far shore, and many companies do that. And then on the same token, on the non-employee side, the non-employees could be stateside or similarly offshore to, providers in technology, for example, the tier one providers, or, providers like yourselves on the state side where you have to augment your current workforce with professional services, with expertise that is sometimes scarce or not available within the company. And those models could go from staff augmentation. There's freelance work, obviously, which sometimes people use in a synonymous manner. But there's administrative services that people hire. There's crowdsourcing is a strategy that is very seldom used, but is useful in certain use cases. So how do you really bring all of this together into a cohesive global workforce strategy is, I think, essential for organizations to think about and to acknowledge the fact that for some reason, through all these years, the employee side has remained the domain of the HR organization, right? And the non-employee side has remained the domain of the procurement organization. So it's influenced by the line of businesses. I need 3, programmers, or I need 3 guys to do financial, bookkeeping, or treasury experts or tax experts. But all that third party or non-employee stuff is with procurement. So that's another challenge, is that you've got 2 very strong leadership silos sometimes, where the left-hand side and the right-hand side are not communicating with each other to make a cohesive, single strategy for human capital.
And what would you say, is there one starting point for those type of transformation that you typically see? So as you mentioned, it can save cost. Of course, it can be very strategic that you say maybe we, offshore certain parts of the business. Is it, the manager comes and says, look, we need to save costs X%. Now let's think about how we do it with our current workforce. Or is it maybe the HR people coming and say, look, we don't find people in the market anymore. We need to do something to have sufficient talent in the organization. What's the typical starting point that you see for those type of transformations?
So it's usually the former. Of lately, the latter has started to become more prevalent, right? And especially in customer service areas, attrition, especially in the United States. And I'm sure you can probably share an opinion about Europe. But in the US, the customer support, customer experience people have become a lot more scarce. Attrition is very high. And so HR may come up and say, look, we can't really find all the right resources. Mm-hmm. But generally, it's the former example where the leadership might say, look, we need to do this differently or more economically. And to your point, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the starting thought process was cost savings and wage arbitrage, right? I want to do this in a lower cost, best cost location so that I can get some benefits of lower wages. That has changed today, right? So today, most leading organizations that look to global workforce strategy are not leading with the idea of cost savings. They're leading with the idea of finding the sharpest skills. And the savings follow, but they're not the primary objective. They become almost the secondary objective. So you're looking for ecosystems that have done really, really well in bringing human capital and technology together. And those ecosystems are now, springing up across the globe. The workforce over the last 20, 25 years of this BPO, ITO space has also dramatically evolved. Their expectations of just getting employed and having a wage have dramatically changed to being a contributor to thought leadership, being able to add value to the enterprise. And they want to do a lot more, and they want to be able to give a lot more. And as a consequence, they demand a lot more, not necessarily in pay and benefits, which is obviously there, but also in terms of affiliation and sense of fulfillment. So the marketplace has changed, and it's important to be cognizant that your team is a cohesive team, whether you put it here or you put it with some resources in a best cost location, whether it's employees or non-employees. Collectively, it's a whole bunch of human capital that just needs to have a single mission, work on a similar result or an outcome.
That is fascinating, and I couldn't agree more with it. And Ashish, one thing that struck me is when you said, look, we have the employee side, we have the non-employee side. One is probably more with procurement or the business even, the other one is more with the HR. How do you bring it together? And I often see it's actually more focused on the employees. So do companies at all have on a larger scale that non-employee element on their radar when it comes to strategic workforce management?
So I think it requires a short team leadership. Sometimes companies have effectively got a transformation office. Sometimes companies have a chief strategy office. Just sharing my own example, I am, in the case of Citigroup or Time Warner, reported up to the CIO organization because predominantly what we were doing in technology, even though we touched the other functions. And then through that, we were reporting to, the program was run by a council of CIOs from various lines of businesses. That could have been a council of CFOs if it was in the financial area. But I think it's important that the strategy to deploy human capital in technology or finance or some of these corporate functions or marketing support, analytics, is somewhat central. And the stakeholders obviously over here are, of course, the chief HR officer is a stakeholder and CFO and procurement guys. But the lines of businesses are the guys who have to define their skill set needs and things like that. The execution of that then is parsed out to the employee side or the non-employee side with a very deliberate intent that I want to achieve this much percentage of variability in my workforce, or I want to achieve this much percentage of offshore ability, or this much percentage of freelance and contracted work, or here are the types of projects that we know are short-term, that we will not hire permanent roles for, because when the project's finished, they've got to exit. So the onboarding and offboarding strategies have to be hand in hand. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And so you say ideally you would have some sort of portfolio office where you would have an overview of all the projects, short-term, mid-term, long-term, that are going on in the entire organization. So you could really bring that into play with the workforce strategy.
Yes, I would think so. Almost like an air traffic controller. This is not a heavy organization of 10 people. This is, one or two people who help coordinate and behave like an air traffic controller and say, these types of roles look better if they're internal, here are reasons that we collectively agreed to. These types of roles are better if they were externally sourced through freelance or contracted services, because here is why we agreed we would do that.
And now my thinking is, now you've defined that all, you have that oversight, you have the air traffic control set up. Of course, there are a lot of providers also that would probably tie into that, and that could give you different things. So is it, how would companies best go about it? Do they do it all internally? Do they solve it all with just a portfolio of providers? How should you tackle that as a corporate?
So to complete the topical area of how you would source outside, I just want to, before I get to the provider community, I want to touch very briefly on the captive community, right? So companies obviously have the option to find resources in their own brick and mortar, on their own company, offices, under their own company's offices in foreign lands, and those things are called, global competency centers and things. That takes a lot of time. Some of the larger companies do that. Some of the more medium-sized companies don't really have that kind of flexibility, that kind of scale. And so to your point, the provider option becomes better. So now if you go into the provider option, you have to think about, firstly, I begin almost with the location assessment so that I have my eyes wide open about where do I want to land these resources, right? So, it's a quick sprite analysis, which is social, political, infrastructure, regulatory, technology, and economics and environment, right? So you do a sprite analysis of location so that well, I don't want to be in these geographies for these reasons. When I hire the right providers, these geographies would be fine. So it could be Ireland, it could be Romania, it could be India or Philippines for these skills or those skills, right? So you've got a little bit of a framework that you want to have clarity on, so that you're not led astray. Then you do a quick little RFP on a slate of providers, and ideally empanel more than one, but less than three or less than four. Like 2 to 3 providers that you empanel as your core strategic providers. And what you've done is they can meet you for most of your requirements at most of your places, for most of your roles at most of the destinations that you've chosen. They can help you get the resources that you need. That empanelment process does 2 things. One is the burden to manage the provider slate becomes much more easier. And from a provider perspective, it does, them being empaneled, they now start to consider you as a strategic account. So they're not looking to just place arms and legs into your organization. They're looking to actually place really good talent, because if they are successful and if you're happy as a client, they get more business through that empanelment process. So it's very symbiotic. And some companies, as large as Citigroup, we had almost 10, 12 primary providers. But I think in the middle of the tier, in the middle market, 2 or 3, maximum 4 is adequate. And sometimes you have specialty providers, no doubt. That might have to be an exception, but that should be an adequate process.
And so I think it's very helpful. Would you say there need to be different providers for freelance type of stuff, non-employees, and
absolutely
full-time workforce, or would it make any difference from what you've seen in your experience?
So absolutely. In fact, what I was alluding to was the 3 or 4 in that freelance contracted workforce staff augmentation kind of an environment, right? You don't want to, every time you get a role, you don't want to float a resume out to like 40 different providers or through a process of internet search and things like that. That's what your provider is doing for you. That's the service they bring to the table. They're doing the curation, they're doing the short selection, they're doing maybe even the first interview. That's exactly what the provider's value is. So that's where I was going with those 3 or 4 providers in terms of strategic and panel providers in the freelance contracted space. But the same could be said about if you were using, offshore outsourcing type of providers. Again, there is no need to tender every single opportunity across the field. You empanel a few providers that are strategic, that are important, that deem you to be a strategic account, and you work with them till one of them shows failure, and then you replace them.
Yeah, I mean, I can completely relate to it. So for us, I mean, we're in the staffing industry for freelance consultants. And of course, there it's exactly like this. So once you have a very close strategic relationship, you put skin in the game, and you, of course, want each other to thrive. If it's not like this, well, then it's just very transactional. And of course, you'd rather have those strategic partnerships. And we've seen also clients that do it, and they have, let's say, 10 providers. But it also means every 10th time you may be successful. And then, of course, also the freelancers that get those type of requests, they get it maybe even from 10 providers. And they get swamped with the same request all over. So that's not a very, very good model, I would say, that is sustainable in the long run. So I can completely agree with that view. And I mean, building on your on discussion about workforce challenges. So we have this employee side, we have this non-employee side. Why should companies consider freelancers as a strategic element in their workforce planning? Do you see that happening a lot? Or tend companies more to really bring in people full-time 100%?
So I think freelance is starting to happen a lot more. Some of it is cultural and evolution of our own workforce, right? The younger generation, the gig economy, and a couple of these types of factors. COVID with work from home and a greater need now for a balance between work and work-life balance, right? So there are a couple of social and cultural events that have perpetuated flexible workforce, so to speak. So I think freelance and contracted workforce is here to stay. It's likely to grow. You have large companies like Tesla that do a lot of their work through outsourcing and very little through internal. Right, so the model will get even more prevalent as we adapt new technologies, AI, ML, all this stuff will kind of perpetuate that even further. But it's not because the professionals are choosing to work independently. It's for the need for the organizations to build in variability into their organizations because the business cycles have become shorter, right? So it's not like a predictable every 7 years we will go through a turn. Well, we could go through a turn within the next 3 months for various reasons. And so you don't want to be in that constant, I'm hiring, I'm building, and then I have to shrink and I got to go through a reduction in force, and then it impacts morale. And so with about 20-30% variability in the workforce, you get a lot more, not only agility, but you also get a lot more diversity of the types of skills that you want to hire for your organization, depending upon your project and initiatives pipeline. Fractional roles have become a lot more common. And so companies that are tapping into these opportunities, I think, are far more adept at moving faster, time to market, product evolution or product replacement and enhancement. All of these things, I think they are far more adept at doing that. And to boot, like I said, like we talked about earlier, even though cost is sometimes not the primary driver, to boot, sometimes you actually get all of this done at a lower cost. And when I say lower cost is because most companies tend to look at wages, internal wages, and they compare that with they contrast that with the new hire from a third party. So I pay $100 and I get this guy for $100. So what's the big difference? The big difference is that the person you got from the third party, their benefits were included in there, their real estate or computing infrastructure was included in there. They came with their own computer, things like that. Whereas in your employee side, some of these things are part of corporate expenses, such as real estate and computing infrastructure and things like that. So from an apples to apples perspective, it is an economically beneficial training costs, hiring costs, things like that. it is an economically beneficial proposition, whether you do this stateside or whether you do this offshore and best cost location.
Mm-hmm. And if you say like 20 to 30% could be a good ratio, I mean, obviously it depends probably on the function and on the specifics of the company, but 0 is probably not the right answer.
Yeah, I
looking
mean,
from a cost perspective, yeah. But are there additional ones? So I'm thinking about like innovating also, bringing not only capacity, flexible capacity, but also bringing expertise or new things into the company with that 20 to 30%.
No, absolutely. So I think to your point, I think 20 to 30% at an enterprise level is a great number. There are certain corporate functions that could be much higher, but then there are certain strategic functions that should be much lower. You obviously don't do too much of treasury and tax in the finance department, but you could do a lot of accounts payables and accounts receivables with third parties, right? Same thing in HR. You don't want to do executive compensation, but you could do a lot of screening and talent acquisition roles with third parties. Technology, both build and operate, can be dramatically altered and streamlined with the use of third parties. So going down to an innovation, though, speaking rather academically, right? Innovation is an effort to kind of create a disequilibrium in through either internal innovation or through supply chain, right, or through your suppliers. In a simplistic form, there's a strategic level to it, which probably should be retained. There's a product level to it, which probably should be split in the sense your design architects and solution architects on your product or services probably should be retained. But then there is a doer and execution element of it, right, which can be sourced through this third-party flexible workforce, whether that's freelance, contracted worker, or outsourced services. And especially in a rapidly innovating firm where the pipeline will feed initiatives, some that are duds but have to be explored, some that are going to be really super market winners, right? The reality is that you don't want to staff everything with firm staffs. You want to be able to staff these things so that if, in fact, you launch an initiative, an innovative initiative that you ultimately find is not going to see the light of the day, then you have a good offboarding practice, and that team has to be disbanded. Not all retained, but they've got to be disbanded so that those resources then can funnel to a more winnable initiative that you have in play. So there is a lot of play in companies that innovate rapidly with large R&D that can use this variable workforce.
And would you, I mean, thinking it further, you could even maybe hypothesize, look, if we have 20 to 30% of freelancers, you could maybe use it strategically also as another hiring channel. I don't know if a lot of people would actually join. So from our experience in the freelance consulting industry, a lot of people choose, of course, to be freelancer, and they don't want to get back into a permanent role. But on a larger scale across functions, do you see that freelancer having those 20 to 30% of freelancers can be another talent acquisition channel for companies?
So a lot of companies, especially the larger ones that have the influence or they have the negotiating power because they're very big, they've got large volumes. I think it would be part of their standard contract, the RTH clause, right, which is the right to hire clause. Mm-hmm. It's a fair clause. It basically says, look, Christian, I want to get you to give me a freelance resource. But after 6 months or 9 months, whatever, we agree to, if the resource turns out to be such a sharpshooter and they learn my business and they become crucial to my success, then I obviously want to be able to give them an opportunity to join my firm. And so I need a right to hire clause. Now, to your point, it's still an at-will employment environment. So that individual may still not choose to join the firm, but that's at will for that individual. right? Between the two parties, at least, the arrangement can be legislated that suggests here is contractually what we will do. We will do at least 6 months so that you get the benefit of some billing and recuperate the cost and investment that you made in finding this resource. And then thereafter we hire. And maybe even at that point of hire, there's a small, reward for the provider, 1 month or 2 months worth of equivalent salary or something. But that's a great way to test a resume before you make a commitment, right? Because how often have companies hired great resumes that looked fantastic on paper, only to find that there was a mismatch, either a cultural or a skills or an experiences type of a clash that then led to a separation. So that is a fantastic way to actually de-risk the hiring process.
Right, because you know the person once you have them, you have an informed hire. Of course, that needs to still be also then the wish of the person. But yeah, I completely agree. And do you see any limits where there is a boundary maybe of using independent talent large scale in organizations? Because I see like there's a trend, like more and more companies test it. Also in the freelance consulting space where we are, it's a very growing market. But do you see any limits? Do you see maybe in the future the company persists of 90% freelancers with a very slim management on top and coordinating efforts? Or do you rather see it as a sort of augmentation where teams in larger organizations are augmented with special skills and you basically build very, very niche teams for ever more flexible missions?
So just for clarity, since I know some of the colleagues that have joined the call are from the US, and when you use the term freelance, we're equating it to mean freelance, contracted labor, staff augmentation, collectively as professional services from third-party providers, right? We use that word slightly differently here, but it is, your meaning of the word is more cohesive, more complete in the sense it includes all of those types and likes of resourcing. So now going back to your question. In my experiences, not just through the employers and my consulting engagements, but having participated in industry conferences, what I see more often than not come up as the lines of delineation are core versus non-core. Hey, Ashish, we can't do core stuff with outsourced providers. We can do non-core. And I've never really understood that. I'm not a big advocate of that. What is core? And why is it core? And then because it is core, and if you were in a talent crunch or in a talent scarcity, guess what? You made your core even more burdensome, because now for your non-core, you have the flexibility to go hire people from freelancers and from other providers. But because you defined your core as something you don't want to do that to, and it is your core, it's become even more troublesome to hire the right people, source it with the right skills, because there's a scarcity in the marketplace. So I've really not particularly liked that core, non-core approach to delineating between what can and cannot be with third parties. I prefer more a role-based approach. And a role-based approach to me, and I alluded to a few examples before, right? I might not do tax and treasury roles with a third party because they're crucial and they require certain expertise or local knowledge or whatever, and they require a heck of a lot of education and background. But I might do payroll, I might do accounts payables and receivables. Role-based delineation to me means that design architects, solution architects, the strategy roles, the roles that have high intensity with intellectual property development and definition, the roles that have a high intensity of product lifecycle management, of course, a lot of the senior leadership roles, right? Those are the roles I don't want to source. You can sometimes get a fractional CEO, but that's an intermittent step till you get a fractional CXO. It's an intermittent step till you get to till you fill that position. But generally, you want to keep some of these thought leadership roles internal. But then those roles are usually 10, 15, 20% of an organization. 80% of the organization is execution roles. right? And so what are you doing in that space of execution roles that where just work has to get done? And so that's where I think those are, I think, the better lines to draw than core, non-core. Does that make sense?
Thank you. No, it makes complete sense to me. Yeah, and it's a very interesting. Looking forward to see, of course, how those lines going to shift in the future. I think with regards to time, let's probably also have a look into potential questions. Yeah, and ask our audience if there are questions that they would like to address in particular, as we have, I think, 5 more minutes. And of course, I want to give that opportunity also to the audience. Yeah, maybe to get it started. There was one question around change management. So, what change management strategies are effective when introducing a more freelance-centric workforce model in a traditionally employee-based organization? So, any tips you could share there, how to do that transition?
So the most important, I think, element of change management, and I consider change and communication management as being conjoined, in that there is change management, and then there's a significant amount of communication that has to happen with regards to a program like this, right? Because at the end of the day, what you want to maintain is company culture and morale, and you don't want there to be messaging or rumor mills that that there's going to be a large amount of disruption and work reduction and things like that. So you want to manage that to the extent that you're exercising these options. And a lot of times you're doing this over a course of a number of years. So the disruption is actually a lot less than what enterprise employees often perceive, right? And that's important to message right, to get the narrative right, why we're doing this, what we think the outcome would be, how our journey is going to look like over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years. But in terms of change management, the most important piece of change management that I think gets ignored is helping the demand managers overcome the fear of engaging with third parties. But it's very easy for me as a manager who has 9 people reporting to me to come to work and say, this is my team, right? We work together as 10 of us and we are one team. That's very easy. It's conceptually correct. That's been the tradition of how human capital has been managed. However, managers get really skeptical about, well, 2 of my team, 8 of them or 7 of them are employees, but 2 of them are not. And so are those 2 guys part of my team? Are they going to behave the same way as the rest of the 7? And so that training, that ability to help the demand manager, the hiring manager, to really overcome that fear and to consider that entire team as one cohesive unit is very important element of change management. That's training, that's hand-holding them, helping them, through new tools and toolkits about how to conduct meetings, especially with people who are from different geographies and therefore with different cultures, perhaps even with different, language skills and things like that. So, but the rest of the change management issues and communication issues are no different than any other transformation job. Right? Mm-hmm. So any large transformation that one might do, you may be putting a new whole system as a replacement to an existing system. The discipline that you would go through in terms of managing that change to the user community is no different than what would happen in this space, in that there is a very deliberate approach with a narrative where here's what we think the project would be, here's what we think the impact would be, here are the people who would be impacted, here are the people who would not be impacted and are retained, but are somehow going to feel, disenfranchised, right? So you've got to overcome that.
Great. There is another question that came through from Ellen. Yeah. How much, you see it also, how much of a bearing does leveraging on third parties have on internal talent development or succession planning? Are there potential pitfalls or for companies to look out for?
It's a great question. Succession planning by itself is its own topic. right? Some companies have done it really well, and some companies don't pay attention to it till it becomes a fire drill. When I think about third party, in the context, I think Alan was the one who asked this question. In the context of the right to hire, when you take those options together, you're actually building a broader library of talent that may succeed a manager who's a flight risk. Right? In the sense you had internal resources that could have been, there are obviously some external resources, especially in executive roles. A lot of companies do that. They have identified already, that who they might tap if certain senior executive leaves. But for middle management roles, it is so important to have this extra layer of third-party resources that are currently working on your projects as freelancers and contracted workforce, and you have this built-in to be, right to hire clause. And so now if you have a surprise flight in one of your middle managers, you've got a wider spectrum of people to choose from for that to succeed that particular person, right? So could you use it strategically, Alan? I think you could. It's not something that I think we've used. I'm trying to draw examples in my mind of in the past where if we had a middle manager leave, did we immediately fill them? And it's not an example that comes to my mind, but I can certainly see how the strategy could help you build better succession plans for your middle managers. Now, for your senior leadership, obviously that's a whole different, kind of game. It's a whole different, set of requirements and thought processes.
Thank you. There's been one more question, but I'll skip that for another one, and we come back to it later. There's one around generative AI, and of course, there is a lot of companies experimenting with AI. It's advancing every day. There are new apps coming, and new use cases are being developed. What are the main impacts that you see here for strategic workforce management?
I think they're going to be huge. They're going to be very significant. Generative, and not just generative AI. Generative AI is just a small fraction of the changes that are coming. But AI and machine learning and cognitive computing will displace many roles, especially routine roles in the corporate functions. That does not frighten me as a human capital strategist. Never in our history have we needed less people to do the work that we do globally. Right? It's just never happened. Whether it was the internet and whether it was RPA and robotic process automation, that just doesn't happen. We're going to need more people. We're always going to need more people. I think the problem that we create for ourselves is that we don't reskill the roles that we displace. Right. So we create a gap. We create a tremendous gap between the skills we have and the new roles that we create due to these new technologies. And that is an economic process, a regulatory process that I think regulators should probably pay attention to. In how do you reskill the workforce that gets displaced due to these technologies? But I imagine, so if I look at an example of cybersecurity, right? 20 years ago, cybersecurity was a good subject matter in Hollywood. You saw it in the movies, and you wondered what the hell it was. Today, it's a $175 billion industry. Right? That's just in 2 decades. So that's the same thing that's going to happen with AI and ML and deep learning and things like that. We're going to displace a lot of roles, and we're going to create a lot of roles, some that we haven't even yet imagined, right? You're definitely going to have ethics czars. So you're going to have ethics, kind of almost, organizations in terms of how AI is being deployed. So we haven't imagined a lot of the roles that we will create with AI, but I do not think that the total number of required roles would be any fewer than what we have.
Thank you. There is a last question here from Raunak. This is a bit more referring to the library. What is your favorite book on that bookshelf behind you and why?
Just because it's Ronak, encyclopedia. No, but it's not. It's actually, believe it or not, I just recently finished this. That's what's lying on top. So there's a lot of educational stuff behind which I'm hoping someday osmosis will happen and I'll get it. But I'm more a fiction reader. And so Orphan X, if you haven't read it, it's a super, super book with Greg Hurwitz. And that's the last read that I did. It took me a little while since I got distracted along the way a couple of times. But they are, there's a lot of educational books back there that along the way I championed. I wouldn't even dare to say what might be my my favorite one, because a few of them are actually signed by their respective authors. So God forbid if I pick the wrong one.
Often X. Okay, I'll take a look at that one. Any final comments, Ashish, on the role of workforce management in business success that you want to share with us before we close the session?
So I think the final, we talked earlier about inertia as being the significant challenge, right? And so my conclusion or my thoughts for our collective audience is just do this. Step over that, that inertia and get started. Get started small. Get started with a proof of concept if you have to. Hire 2 people, if not 20, right? But just get past that stalemate. Because you find that the talent that you're looking for is generally available through these talent hubs that are now more accessible to the providers of such talent through the freelance contractor services. Why? Because it is their business to go hunt for these hubs, for these talent pools, for these ecosystems that bring technology and people together. Right, that is your job at EPH, I would think, just as much as it is your job to find consultants, for your client. You're probably spending just about the same amount of energy just finding consultants and where they exist and how to go unearth the silent or the dormant experts, right? Somebody who's happily employed, who isn't looking for a job, but could be a fantastic counselor to many, many, many of your clients, right? So that's what you do really well, and companies need to be able to trust that process and say, look, that's why I want to partner with such firms like EPH, because I want to actually test 2 and then eventually 20, and then you get to the right ratios at some point. Variability in human capital, in my opinion, is addictive. Because the fungibility of that resource pool, even if it's at the 20-30% range, right, it is so remarkably powerful in terms of fulfilling project and initiative work and driving success to initiatives that otherwise normally take 3, 4, 5 years. And you certainly see time to market shrink to 6 months, right, by having good onboarding and offboarding practices. So I think that's my final kind of thought process is just cross over that inertia.
Yeah, and let's go out and go hunting, I would say. And of course, that's what we also do here. And we love to staff projects at Expert Powerhouse. Thanks so much, Ashish. I think for me, it was a very insightful session. Yeah. And of course, thanks a lot for taking the time being with us today. To everyone who's joined today, yeah, of course, also thanks for joining in. And I can encourage you only to follow us on LinkedIn for future events that we will have. Thanks a lot, Ashish, for taking the time today. And everyone, have a great day and see you soon.
Thank you for having me, Christian.
Thank you.